Chapter 5 The Loneliness of Obedience. Colleen broke up with Jack. She knew it was right, but ending the relationship was the hardest thing she had ever done. 5 years of togetherness, 5 years of hoping and praying. But Jack had no real interest in Jesus. Oh, he'd come to church with Colleen, and he even attended a men's Bible study for a few months. But his heart was never in it. Colleen's friends could see what she could not, that Jack did those things only to keep peace with Colleen. Colleen had finally come to understand the godly counsel she received throughout her years with Jack. God calls us away from what compromises our devotion to Him, she'd been told repeatedly. Yet rather than face this reality, Colleen had chosen to remain with Jack in hopes of his becoming a Christian. "I'm not giving up on him," she told her friends. "I have faith that God will change him." But Colleen hadn't understood until recently that clinging to Jack was not faith, it was disobedience. Accepting the truth gave her courage to end the relationship. Colleen had another motivation for leaving Jack. She turned 32, desiring a family of her own. She had to face the fact that Jack might never become husband material, and therefore she should free herself for a godly man. So a few months after the breakup from Jack, once the grief abated, Colleen began to anticipate the future, and she threw herself into activities where she could meet a prospective husband. 1 or 2 men seemed promising initially, but neither prospect panned out. So after a few months, Colleen redoubled her efforts and joined a few internet matchmaking sites. Nothing. No one. Those were Colleen's reflections as she lay in bed the morning of her 35th birthday, a milestone she did not want to get up and face. Still single, no real prospects. Meanwhile, she learned 2 months earlier that Jack had gotten married. Why hadn't God blessed her? She'd been obedient. She'd placed herself in the right spiritual position. Now at 35, she was no closer to having her own family. She felt as though God had let her down, leaving her alone and lonely as she resented it. What did we expect? Before we pass judgment on Colleen, let's ask ourselves whether we are really that much different. Have we ever obeyed God as a bargaining chip? That's exactly what's going on when our hope for blessing is rooted, as Colleen's is, in placing ourselves in the right spiritual position. And sometimes it's not that we place ourselves there. Life does it to us. A man breaks up with us, or we lose our job, or some other kind of difficulty takes us through a time of spiritual stretching, and we come to believe that as a result, some major, tangible blessing is right around the corner. When that doesn't happen, we so often wind up right where Colleen did, resentful. The truth is, walking faithfully with the Lord leads sometimes to the very opposite of what we want. So we need to forget the idea that there's a direct correspondence between obedience and the earthly blessings we so much hope for. Jesus himself cautioned would-be disciples to count the cost of following him, because there would indeed be a cost. Sometimes that cost is loneliness. Are we willing for that? Or will we resent God and turn away in unbelief? It all depends on why we've been following him in the first place. The day after Jesus miraculously fed 5,000 people, a large number of them sought to follow him. But he said to them, "You are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves." John 6:25-26. When the trials and tests of faith hit and our dreams don't seem to be coming true, it's often then that we'll know if we treasure him for who he is or for what we've been hoping he'll do for us. If we resent how he has ordered our life, we can be sure we've been following him for the wrong reasons. The cost of obedience. We can benefit from thinking about Joseph at this point, especially as we see him in Genesis 39, where we find him working as overseer in the house of an Egyptian official named Potiphar. Up to this point, the circumstances of Joseph's life had been largely dictated by others. His brothers had sold him to slave traders who had brought him down to Egypt, where he was purchased by Potiphar. Nevertheless, we are told the Lord was with Joseph. Verse 2. Ultimately, man was not dictating Joseph's life. God was. And the Lord blessed Joseph by giving him great success in his endeavors, such that his reputation and responsibilities grew greater. But Joseph's climb to the top came tumbling down, once again through the actions of others, this time a woman. Potiphar's wife lusted after Joseph and tried to seduce him. Day after day she made her appeal, yet Joseph continually rebuffed her, saying, "Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Genesis 39, 8 through 9. But she persisted, and finally her verbal appeals became physical. She grabbed Joseph's clothing one day and tried to pull him into a sexual encounter. But Joseph tore away from her and ran out of the house. In the proverbial fury of a woman's scorn, Potiphar's wife claimed that Joseph had tried to molest her, and as a result, Joseph was thrown in prison. Can we not see clearly here that obedience to God isn't necessarily a straight path to tangible blessing? It certainly wasn't for Joseph. He went from trusted servant to despised prisoner. And there's no doubt that the prison to which he was sent lacked court-appointed defense attorneys and cable television. To the contrary, we're told in Psalm 105 that his feet were hurt with fetters and his neck was put in a collar of iron. Verse 18. And all this because he obeyed God. Nevertheless, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Genesis 39, verses 21 and 23. In time, Joseph was given the care of two men in the prison, royal officials who'd been banished from the administration for displeasing their ruler, Pharaoh. By means of a divine gift, Joseph was enabled to interpret the dreams of these imprisoned officials, asking only in return that the one soon to be released would afterward come to Joseph's aid. But despite Joseph's requests, the released prisoner did not remember Joseph but forgot him. Joseph would languish in prison 2 more years before the Lord orchestrated his release and began to unfold a powerful redemptive plan in which Joseph was to play a primary role. How did Joseph fare during this time? We aren't told what he thought or felt. All we know is that he survived it. We can be sure, however, that loneliness was a dominant theme in his heart, as evidenced from the fact that he was forgotten, not remembered. Being forgotten is always lonely, which is why some people dread their birthday. Better no birthday at all than to have it forgotten by those who matter to us. We tell ourselves it's a little thing, and really it is. If we just get our eyes off ourselves and onto others, it wouldn't matter at all. We know that's true, and we so much don't want it to matter, yet it still stings, and that sting is the loneliness of being forgotten. There's really no comparison between a forgotten birthday and Joseph's plight. The point is, he was lonely. He'd been mistreated by so many and then cast off and forgotten by others. Perhaps Joseph was tempted during this dark time to attribute those same things to God. We don't know what went through his mind. We're told only that the word of the Lord tested him. Psalms 105:19. Yet although we aren't told much about Joseph's state of mind, we know the Lord was with him every moment of every dark day, and that he was directing everything and everyone to the end he intended. The fact of God's sovereign and loving presence is evident to us. But it likely wasn't always as clear to Joseph. Did he ever think how much easier it would have been to simply give in to Potiphar's wife? We don't know. What we do know is that he didn't give in. He resisted. He refused to sin against God, no matter the cost. How different we are from Joseph. If we're honest, most of us have to admit we're a lot more like Colleen. We work to get our spiritual house in order by obeying God, but no big payoff results. In fact, our circumstances often seem worse afterward. When that happens, we so easily find ourselves grumbling or second-guessing our obedience. But that's the very point at which our faith is being tested. Do we obey God because we love him? Are we disciples because our passion has been captured by God's redemptive plans, not only for ourselves personally, but for all his people? Because if it's primarily about what we get from him in the here and now, we will wind up disillusioned, unbelieving, and black hole lonely. Regardless of all that might have gone through Joseph's mind during his miserable imprisonment, He did not regret his obedience, and not only because he later became second in command over all of Egypt. It's because God's agenda was Joseph's agenda. In other words, Joseph saw everything that had happened to him as a means to advance God's plans and purposes. And he had embraced that as his own purpose. Just look at what he said to his brothers when they were finally reunited. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine had been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. Genesis 45, 5-8. No anger, no revenge, just a matter-of-fact statement about God's sovereign oversight and redemptive plan. It's likely that Joseph's deepest insight into the purposes of God were developed and established while his faith was being tested. God always has a redemptive purpose in the lonely seasons of his people, not just for the benefit of the lonely one, but also for many survivors. Lonely times are preparatory times, but we will be able to see this and embrace the goodness of it only if we make God's purposes our own. That's what Joseph did. Yet the story of Joseph doesn't end with Joseph. He points us to someone else who was mistreated and suffered for his obedience, Jesus Christ, the greater Joseph. Like Joseph, Jesus was tempted, and like Joseph, he resisted. See Matthew 4, 1-11. But Jesus' resistance was also different. Unlike Joseph, Jesus resisted for us on our behalf. His refusal to give in to temptation covers us when we do. Jesus' perfect obedience to the Father is applied to our imperfect, half-hearted, mixed motive obedience. On top of that, all Joseph's difficulties point forward to the trials Jesus experienced as a man. Joseph was able to free his brothers from self-recrimination over all they'd done by pointing them to God's bigger purpose, which found its ultimate fulfillment at the cross of Christ. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, for the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Romans 8, verses 1-4. In Christ, we are not condemned, and we have been set free to walk according to the Spirit. And because we're indwelt by the Spirit, we too, like Joseph, are now privy to God's overarching purposes to preserve many people alive. Joseph was a short-term redeemer for a limited number of people, but the one he points to is a redeemer for all people, for all time, through his life, death, and resurrection. The redemption of many lives through the power of God. Joseph was on board with God's plan. The question is, are we? Colleen gave up something she wanted, a boyfriend, for something she wanted more, a husband. But her plan didn't work out as she hoped. She has a wrong understanding of how God works and what his purposes are. And because of that, today she is not only lonely, she is also bitter. She believes God let her down. Of course, that's not true. God's agenda is just entirely different and so much bigger. His plans for Colleen may include marriage. Whether they do or don't, God's plans for Colleen most definitely include bringing her into his big picture work of redemption in a particular place with particular people. That doesn't mean she won't be alone at times, and no doubt there will be lonely seasons. But even then, if she will forsake her agenda and take up God's, she will find peace and fullness of life. Obedience is never regrettable, and if God's purposes become ours, we will know that truth in our own experience. It's what Paul meant when he told us to offer ourselves to God as a living sacrifice, to let go of our own goals in order to participate in God's. And in so doing, we will find that what God does with our life is good and acceptable and perfect. Romans 12, verses 1-2.